In the heart of Chicago, Illinois, a man known only as Mr. Castellano commanded respect with a single glance. No waitress dared approach his corner booth at Rossi's Italian restaurant, until one night, a young woman named Ivy walked straight up to him, placed a faded photograph on his table, and watched as the most feared man in the city broke down in tears. What she revealed would unravel decades of secrets and change both their lives forever. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Rossi's Italian restaurant on West Taylor Street, each drop catching the amber glow of the streetlights outside. Inside, the scent of garlic and basil hung thick in the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of wine glasses. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and the restaurant hummed with its usual rhythm. Waiters gliding between tables, the kitchen doors swinging open to release bursts of heat and sound, the espresso machine hissing like a serpent in the corner. But in the back, in the corner booth beneath the painting of the Amalfi Coast, there was always silence. Vincent Castellano sat alone, as he did every Thursday at 8 o'clock. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver-threaded hair combed back from a face that might have been handsome once, before life had carved lines of authority and loss into his features. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, and his hands, strong, scarred hands, rested on either side of an untouched glass of Chianti. He didn't look at the other diners. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was. The waitresses knew too. They drew straws in the back, and whoever lost had to approach his table with trembling hands, set down his usual order, veal marsala, no vegetables, extra sauce, and retreat as quickly as possible without making eye contact. Some quit after their first encounter. Others requested different shifts. Vincent Castellano didn't speak to them, didn't acknowledge them beyond a curt nod, but his presence alone was enough to make grown men nervous and young women reconsider their career choices. Maria, the head waitress, had worked at Rossi's for 23 years. She'd seen Vincent grow from a young man with fire in his eyes to the cold, unreachable figure he was now. She remembered when he used to smile, when he'd come in with his wife, Elena, and their laughter would fill the restaurant like music. But Elena had been gone for 15 years, and the man who remained was a ghost of who he'd been, a ghost with power, with connections, with blood on his hands that no amount of rain could wash away. Tonight, Maria stood by the kitchen doors, watching the new girl with a mixture of pity and concern. Ivy had started just 2 weeks ago, fresh-faced and eager, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and green eyes that still held optimism. She was 24, putting herself through nursing school, and she worked with the kind of determined grace that reminded Maria of herself decades ago, before the world had taught her to be careful. "You don't have to do this," Maria said, her voice low. "I can take his table tonight." Ivy shook her head, adjusting the notepad in her apron pocket. "I need the tips, Maria. And he's just a customer, right? Just another person who needs to eat." Maria wanted to tell her that Vincent Castellano was not just another person, that the corner booth was a throne, and the man who sat there ruled half of Chicago's South Side with an iron fist wrapped in expensive Italian leather. She wanted to explain that the last waitress who'd spilled water on his table had left in tears and never came back, that the busboy who'd accidentally bumped his chair had been transferred to the dish pit and eventually fired for reasons no one would discuss. But Ivy's jaw was set with that stubborn determination Maria recognized all too well, and she knew words wouldn't change the girl's mind. "Just be quick," Maria finally said. "Don't ask questions. Don't linger." Ivy nodded and picked up the tray with Vincent's order. She moved through the restaurant with practiced efficiency, weaving between tables, her smile polite but distant. The rain outside intensified, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass, and somewhere in the kitchen, a pan clattered to the floor, the sound sharp and startling. Vincent didn't look up when Ivy approached. He was staring at the painting on the wall, the Amalfi Coast, with its impossible blue water and white buildings clinging to cliffs like prayers. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone, and for a moment, Ivy hesitated. But then she thought of her tuition bill, of her mother's medical expenses, of all the reasons she couldn't afford to be afraid, and she stepped forward. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice steady. "I have your veal marsala." She set the plate down carefully, precisely, the way Maria had taught her. No sudden movements, No unnecessary words. But as she turned to leave, something made her pause. A photograph, small and worn, tucked partially beneath the salt shaker on his table. It must have slipped from his pocket, or perhaps he'd been looking at it before she arrived. She could see just the edge of it, the corner of a woman's face, a smile frozen in time. Vincent's hand shot out, covering the photograph with a speed that made Ivy flinch. His eyes met hers for the first time, and they were dark, not with anger, but with something deeper, something that looked like pain wrapped in warning. "You saw nothing," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Of course," Ivy replied quickly. "I'm sorry." She walked away, her heart pounding, feeling his gaze on her back until she disappeared into the safety of the kitchen. Maria was waiting, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You okay?" Ivy nodded, but her hands were shaking as she set down the empty tray. She couldn't stop thinking about that photograph, about the way Vincent's entire demeanor had shifted in that single moment, from untouchable to vulnerable, from stone to flesh. She'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and now she couldn't unsee it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Chicago clean, at least for tonight. Inside Rossi's, Vincent Castellano sat alone in his corner booth, the photograph now safely back in his jacket pocket, pressed against his heart like a secret he'd carried for far too long. He didn't touch his food. He never did. He just sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of better days, and waited for time to pass. Ivy worked the rest of her shift in a daze, her mind circling back to that moment again and again. There was something about Vincent Castellano that didn't match the stories she'd heard, something broken beneath the armor, something human, and though she knew she should forget what she'd seen, should keep her head down and her questions to herself, a small seed of curiosity had been planted. By the time her shift ended at 11, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Ivy walked out into the cool October night, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders. The streets of Little Italy were quiet now, the restaurants closing, the last patrons stumbling home. She thought about her mother, waiting for her in their small apartment in Pilsen, thought about the bills piling up, the impossible weight of trying to build a better life, one shift at a time. She didn't notice the black car parked across the street, or the man inside watching her walk away. She didn't see Vincent Castellano sitting in the back seat, his eyes following her until she turned the corner and disappeared into the night. And she didn't know that her life had just changed, that the photograph she'd glimpsed had set something in motion that neither of them could stop. In his pocket, Vincent's fingers traced the edges of the photograph. Elena, smiling, forever young, forever gone. And for the first time in 15 years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't as buried as he'd thought. The following Thursday, Ivy arrived at Rossi's with the same determination that had carried her through nursing school exams and double shifts at the hospital where she volunteered. The October chill had deepened, and the streets of Chicago's Little Italy were dressed in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot like whispered secrets. She tied her apron with practiced efficiency, nodding to Maria, who watched her with the wary eyes of someone who'd seen too many bright young things dimmed by the realities of this neighborhood. Vincent Castellano's corner booth remained empty until precisely 8 o'clock, as always. Ivy had learned his patterns over the past week, the way he arrived alone, the way he never looked at the menu, the way he sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, a habit born from years of watching for threats. Tonight, when he entered, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they lowered, became more careful, as if the very air recognized his presence. Ivy picked up his usual order without being asked. Maria had tried to assign the table to someone else, but Ivy had volunteered, driven by something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or that stubborn streak her mother always said would either save her or destroy her. As she approached the corner booth, she noticed something different about Vincent tonight. His jaw was tighter, his shoulders more rigid, and there was a fresh cut above his left eyebrow, barely visible, but unmistakably recent. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," he said, setting down the veal marsala with the same careful precision as before. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Ivy felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. His eyes were the color of espresso, dark and bitter, and they held an intelligence that made her realize the stories about him, the whispered tales of violence and power, were probably only half the truth. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," I need the job. Something flickered across his face. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Most don't come back after the first week. I'm not most people. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. No, I suppose you're not. He dismissed her with a slight nod, and Ivy returned to her other tables, but she felt his gaze on her throughout the evening, tracking her movements with an attention that should have been unsettling, but somehow wasn't. There was no threat in it, only observation, as if he were trying to figure out a puzzle he hadn't known existed. The restaurant filled and emptied as the hours passed. Ivy served families celebrating birthdays, couples on dates, groups of friends laughing over shared plates of pasta. But always, in the corner, Vincent sat alone, his food untouched, his wine glass full. Around 10 o'clock, 2 men entered. Expensive suits, cold eyes, the kind of men who made other men nervous. They approached Vincent's booth without hesitation, and Ivy watched from across the room as they spoke in low, urgent tones. Vincent's expression never changed, but his hands, those scarred, capable hands, curled into fists on the table. One of the men placed a manila envelope beside his plate. Vincent didn't open it. He simply stared at it as if it contained something toxic, something that could poison him just by proximity. The men left after 5 minutes, and Vincent sat there, motionless, for another 10, before finally sliding the envelope into his jacket pocket. When Ivy brought his check, she noticed his hands were trembling. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there, a crack in the armor. She set the leather folder down gently, and as she turned to leave, Vincent spoke. "What's your name?" She turned back, surprised. "Ivy, sir. Ivy Morrison." "Morrison." He repeated it as if testing the weight of it. "Irish?" "On my father's side. He passed when I was young." Vincent nodded slowly. "And your mother?" She's sick. Cancer. That's why I'm working here, putting myself through nursing school. The medical bills." She stopped, unsure why she was telling him this, why she felt compelled to explain herself to this man who was essentially a stranger, albeit a dangerous one. "You take care of her alone?" "Yes, sir. It's just the 2 of us." Something in Vincent's expression shifted then, softened in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. He reached into his jacket, not for the envelope, but for something else. The photograph. He held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the edge, and then he set it on the table between them. "This was my wife," he said quietly. "Elena." Ivy looked at the photograph, at the woman with dark hair and a smile that could light up rooms. She was beautiful, radiantly so, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of kindness, of warmth. "She's lovely." She was. Vincent's voice was rough, scraped raw by memory. "She died 15 years ago. Breast cancer. I had all the money in the world, all the connections, all the power, and I couldn't save her. I couldn't do a damn thing except watch her fade away." Ivy felt tears prick her eyes. She understood that helplessness, that rage against the unfairness of illness, of watching someone you love suffer while you stand by, powerless. "I'm so sorry." Vincent looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd started working at Rossi's, she saw him as he truly was. Not a mafia boss, not a figure of fear, but a man who'd loved and lost and never quite figured out how to live in the aftermath. She used to volunteer at the hospital, St. Anthony's over on West 19th. She'd spend hours there, reading to patients, bringing them flowers, making them feel less alone. She said everyone deserves dignity, especially at the end. "That's where I volunteer," Ivy said softly. "St. Anthony's, in the oncology ward." Vincent's eyes widened slightly, and something passed between them, a connection, fragile and unexpected, built on shared understanding of loss and the desperate human need to make meaning from suffering. He picked up the photograph, held it for another moment, then tucked it back into his jacket. "Thank you," he said, "for listening. Anytime, Mr. Castellano." "Vincent," he corrected. "When it's just us, you can call me Vincent." Ivy nodded, feeling as if she'd just crossed some invisible threshold, entered some space where the rules were different. She left him then, returning to her closing duties, but the conversation stayed with her, echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't quite forget. Outside, the temperature had dropped, and the first hints of winter were creeping into the Chicago air. Vincent left at 11, as always, but this time he paused at the door and looked back at Ivy, who was wiping down tables. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. before disappearing into the night. Maria approached Ivy as she was counting her tips. "What did he say to you?" "He told me about his wife." Maria's expression shifted to something like shock. "Vincent Castellano doesn't talk about Elena. Not to anyone. Not ever. Maybe he needed to," Ivy said simply. That night, as Ivy rode the bus home to Pilsen, she thought about Vincent's hands trembling over that envelope, about the way he'd looked at Elena's photograph as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to humanity. She thought about her own mother, sleeping fitfully in their small apartment, fighting a battle that seemed increasingly unwinnable, and she realized that pain was pain, regardless of who you were or what you'd done. Grief didn't discriminate. Loss didn't care about power or money or fear. When she got home, her mother was awake, sitting up in bed, her thin frame wrapped in blankets despite the heater running. "How was work, sweetheart?" "Interesting," Ivy said, helping her mother settle back down. "I met someone tonight, someone who understands." Her mother smiled, her eyes already closing. "That's good. Everyone needs someone who understands." Ivy sat with her until she fell asleep, then went to her own room and stared at the ceiling, thinking about corner booths and faded photographs and the strange, unexpected ways that lives could intersect. She didn't know that across the city, Vincent Castellano was sitting in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the manila envelope open on his desk, its contents spread before him like accusations. She didn't know that the trembling in his hands had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with rage. Rage at the men who thought they could threaten him, who thought 15 years had made him soft, who didn't understand that a man who'd lost everything had nothing left to lose. And she didn't know that her kindness, her simple act of listening, had reminded him of something he'd forgotten, that beneath the armor, beneath the reputation, beneath the blood and the power, he was still human, still capable of feeling, still, perhaps, capable of redemption. The rain began again, soft and steady, washing the streets of Chicago clean. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing winds that howled down Michigan Avenue, and temperatures that made Chicagoans dig out their heavy coats and curse the approaching winter. Ivy's mother had taken a turn for the worse, and the hospital bills were mounting faster than Ivy could work. She'd picked up extra shifts at Rossi's, arriving early and staying late, her body exhausted but her determination unshaken. Maria worried about her, pressing extra food into her hands at the end of each shift, but Ivy just smiled and promised she was fine, even though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. Vincent had become a fixture in her Thursdays, but now he came on Tuesdays as well, then Saturdays, his visits increasing with a frequency that had the other waitresses whispering. He always requested Ivy's section, always ordered the same meal he never ate, always left tips that were generous enough to raise eyebrows, but not so excessive as to feel like charity. They talked, brief conversations that felt both ordinary and extraordinary, about the weather, about the city, about nothing and everything. He never mentioned his business, and she never asked, but the tension in his shoulders grew more pronounced with each visit, and the envelope-delivering men came more often, their expressions growing harder, more insistent. One Saturday evening in mid-November, Ivy was clearing Vincent's table when she noticed blood on his napkin. Not much, just a few drops, but unmistakable. She looked at him, concerned, and saw that his knuckles were split, the skin raw and angry. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing. Let me at least get you some ice. Ivy, I'm studying to be a nurse, remember? I've seen worse." She didn't wait for his permission, just went to the kitchen and returned with a clean towel wrapped around ice. She sat down across from him, a breach of protocol that would have gotten her fired if anyone else had noticed, and reached for his hand. Vincent hesitated, then allowed her to take it. His hand was large, warm, and she could feel the strength in it, the capacity for violence, but also the way he held himself carefully, as if afraid he might break her with too firm a grip. She pressed the ice gently against his knuckles, and he winced, but didn't pull away. "What happened?" she asked softly. "A disagreement. Must have been some disagreement." He almost smiled. "You could say that." They sat in silence for a moment, the restaurant buzzing around them, oblivious to the strange intimacy of this moment. A Mafia boss and a waitress, connected by ice and blood and something neither of them could quite name. Finally, Vincent spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "There are people who want what I have, my territory, my businesses, my influence. They think because I've been quiet these past years, because I've kept to myself, that I've gone soft. They're testing me, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they can go before I push back. And will you? Push back? His eyes met hers, and she saw the answer there before he spoke. I don't have a choice. In my world, weakness is death. If I don't respond, if I don't show strength, everything I've built will crumble. And the people who depend on me, the families I protect, the businesses I keep safe, they'll be left to the wolves. Is that what you tell yourself? Ivy asked, not unkindly. That you're protecting people? Vincent's jaw tightened. You think I'm a monster. I think you're a man who's made choices. We all make choices. But I also think... She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think you're tired. I think you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you don't know how to put it down. He stared at her, and for a moment she thought she'd gone too far, crossed some line that couldn't be uncrossed. But then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. Elena used to say the same thing. She'd tell me I was drowning in my own decisions, that I needed to find a way to surface before it was too late. Was she right? She was always right. He pulled his hand back gently, flexing his fingers. But knowing something and being able to change it are two different things. I'm in too deep, Ivy. Have been for 30 years. There's no surfacing for men like me. There's only endurance. Ivy wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that it was never too late, that people could change, that redemption was always possible. But she'd seen enough of the world to know that some prisons were built from choices, and the locks were on the inside. Instead, she just squeezed his hand once more before standing. Well, for what it's worth, I don't think you're a monster. I think you're human, and humans can surprise themselves. She left him then, returning to her other tables, but she felt his eyes on her for the rest of the evening, thoughtful and searching. When he left that night, he pressed something into her hand, an envelope, thick and heavy. She tried to refuse, but he closed her fingers around it firmly. For your mother's medical bills, he said. Don't argue. Elena would have wanted me to help. Before Ivy could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the November night like smoke. She opened the envelope in the back room and nearly dropped it when she saw the contents. $10,000 in cash, neatly bundled. It was more money than she'd seen in 6 months of work, maybe more. It was salvation and complication wrapped together, and she didn't know whether to cry or laugh or chase after him and throw it back in his face. Maria found her standing there, staring at the money. Sweet Jesus. What did you do? Nothing. I listened to him. That's all. Honey, men like Vincent Castellano don't give away that kind of money for nothing. You need to be careful. Whatever's happening between you two, nothing's happening, Ivy said quickly. He's helping. Because of his wife, because she would have done the same. Maria looked skeptical, but didn't push. Just be careful. Vincent's world isn't like ours. The people around him, the things he's involved in, it's dangerous, and once you're in, it's hard to get out. Ivy knew Maria was right, but as she rode the bus home that night, the envelope hidden in her bag, she couldn't bring herself to regret accepting it. Her mother needed treatment, needed hope, and Vincent had given her both. Whatever his reasons, whatever complications might follow, she was grateful. But gratitude, she would learn, always came with a price. The following Tuesday, Ivy arrived at work to find the restaurant in chaos. Police cars were parked outside, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. Maria was standing by the door, her face pale, and when she saw Ivy, she grabbed her arm. There was a shooting, last night after we closed. Someone tried to hit one of Vincent's men in the parking lot. Nobody died, thank God, but she trailed off, shaking her head. Ivy felt her stomach drop. Is Vincent... He's fine. He wasn't here. But this is what I was talking about, Ivy. This is his world. Violence, retaliation, endless cycles of blood. You need to stay away from him. But even as Maria said it, Ivy knew she couldn't. Because somewhere between the corner booth and the faded photograph, between the ice on his knuckles and the envelope in her bag, she'd started to care about Vincent Castellano. Not as a mafia boss, not as a figure of fear, but as a man, flawed, damaged, but still fighting to hold on to whatever scraps of humanity he had left. That Thursday, Vincent came to Rossi's as usual, but he looked different, harder. The vulnerability she'd glimpsed was buried again beneath layers of steel, and when he looked at her, his eyes were cold. You shouldn't be here, he said when she approached his table. It's my job. It's dangerous. The people coming after me, They won't hesitate to use anyone close to me as leverage. You need to quit. Find another restaurant. No. His eyes flashed. This isn't a request, Ivy. And I'm not one of your soldiers, Vincent. You don't get to order me around. She set his plate down with more force than necessary. I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid of whoever's trying to hurt you. I've faced scarier things than gangsters. I've watched my mother fight cancer for 2 years. I've held the hands of dying patients and told them it would be okay even when I knew it wouldn't. So don't you dare try to protect me by pushing me away. They stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Finally, Vincent's expression softened, and he let out a long breath. You're stubborn. So I've been told. And reckless. That too. He shook his head, but there was something like admiration in his eyes. Elena was stubborn too. Drove me crazy, but it was also what I loved most about her. That fire, that refusal to back down. Ivy sat down across from him again, lowering her voice. Tell me what's happening. Let me understand. And so he did. He told her about the Moretti family, rivals from the north side who'd been encroaching on his territory for months. He told her about the shipments that had gone missing, the businesses that had been vandalized, the subtle and not so subtle threats. He told her about the choice he faced, respond with overwhelming force and reignite a war that had been dormant for 15 years, or show restraint and risk losing everything he'd built. What would Elena want you to do? Ivy asked. Vincent was quiet for a long time. She'd want me to walk away, to find another path, but I don't know if I can. This life, this power, it's all I have left of who I was before she died. If I give it up, what's left? You, Ivy said simply. Just you. And maybe that's enough. He looked at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language, as if the concept of being enough without power, without fear, without the armor he'd worn for so long was incomprehensible. And maybe it was. Maybe some men were so defined by their choices that removing them would leave nothing but empty space. But as Ivy returned to work, she held on to hope, fragile, perhaps foolish, but real, that Vincent Castellano might still find a way to surface, to breathe, to become something more than the sum of his sins. Outside, the November wind howled, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. December came to Chicago with a brutality that matched the city's reputation. The temperature plummeted, the wind off Lake Michigan cut like knives, and the first major snowstorm of the season buried the streets under 8 inches of white that quickly turned gray with exhaust and salt. Ivy's mother had been admitted to St. Anthony's Hospital 3 days after Thanksgiving, her condition deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about making her comfortable and quality of life, phrases that meant everything and nothing, that translated to the one truth Ivy wasn't ready to accept. Her mother was dying. She worked her shifts at Rossi's in a fog, moving through the motions with mechanical efficiency, while her mind remained trapped in that hospital room, watching monitors beep and IV bags drip, and her mother's chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty. Vincent noticed immediately. He always noticed. On the first Thursday of December, when Ivy approached his table with red-rimmed eyes and hands that shook as she set down his plate, he caught her wrist gently. What happened? My mother. She's in the hospital. I don't think. Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Vincent stood, something he never did during dinner service, and guided her to sit in his booth. The restaurant seemed to freeze, every eye turning toward them. But he didn't care. He sat beside her, not across, and let her cry into his shoulder while his hand rested carefully on her back, offering comfort in the only way he knew how, through presence, through silence, through the simple act of not leaving. I'm sorry, Ivy finally managed, pulling back and wiping her eyes. I shouldn't. Don't apologize. Not for this. Never for this. His voice was rough, heavy with his own memories. I know what it's like to watch someone you love slip away. I know how it feels to be powerless, to have all the money and connections in the world and still be unable to stop it. It's the worst kind of hell. I used your money for her treatment, the $10,000. It bought her 2 more months, maybe 3. 2 more months of consciousness, of being able to talk to me, to tell me she loves me. I don't know if that was worth it, if I just prolonged her suffering, but I couldn't just let her go without fighting. You did the right thing, Vincent said firmly. Every moment matters. Every conversation, every touch, every I love you, they matter. When Elena died, I would have given everything I owned for just 1 more day, 1 more hour. You gave your mother that gift. Don't ever regret it. They sat together for a long moment, two people bound by grief, by the universal human experience of loving someone who was leaving. Finally, Maria approached, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Ivy, honey, why don't you go home? I'll cover your tables." "No, I need to work. I need the money for—" "Go home," Vincent said, his tone brooking no argument. "Go be with your mother. I'll take care of the bills." "Vincent, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering. Please. Let me do this. Let me help." There was something desperate in his voice, something that spoke to his own need for redemption, for the chance to save someone when he'd failed to save Elena. Ivy wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, her pride. But she was so tired, so worn down by months of fighting and working and watching her mother fade. So she nodded, squeezed Vincent's hand in gratitude, and left Rossi's, heading into the December night toward St. Anthony's Hospital. She didn't see the black SUV that followed her, didn't notice the men inside, their faces hard and calculating, didn't realize that by accepting Vincent Castellano's help, by becoming someone he cared about, she'd painted a target on her back. Vincent knew, though. He'd known from the moment he'd given her that first envelope, from the moment he'd allowed himself to care about someone again. As he watched Ivy leave through the restaurant window, his jaw tightened, and he pulled out his phone, making a call he'd hoped to avoid. "Marco, I need security on someone. A girl named Ivy Morrison. She's going to St. Anthony's Hospital. I want eyes on her 24/7. Discreet but thorough. If anyone from the Moretti family gets within 100 feet of her, I want to know immediately." He ended the call and sat back down in his booth, his food cold and untouched as always. Maria approached cautiously. "You care about her." It wasn't a question, but Vincent answered anyway. "She reminds me of Elena. That same fire, that same stubborn determination to see the good in people, even when they don't deserve it. The Morettis know about her? They will soon if they don't already. They've been watching me, looking for weaknesses. And Ivy," he trailed off, his hands curling into fists. "I should have stayed away from her, should have kept my distance. But I was selfish. I wanted to feel human again, wanted to remember what it was like to talk to someone who didn't fear me or want something from me. And now she's in danger because of it." Maria sat down across from him, something she'd never dared to do in 23 years. "So what are you going to do?" "What I should have done months ago. I'm going to end this. The Morettis want a war? I'll give them one. But it'll be the last war they ever fight." There was no bravado in his voice, no anger, just cold, calculated certainty. Maria had known Vincent long enough to recognize that tone, to understand what it meant. She stood, her expression sad. "Just don't lose yourself completely, Vincent. Elena wouldn't want that. Elena's dead," he said flatly, "and the man she loved died with her. What's left is just survival." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Ivy had awakened something in him, some dormant part of his humanity that he'd thought was buried forever, and that made her both his salvation and his greatest vulnerability. At St. Anthony's Hospital, Ivy sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand and telling her about her day, about the customers at Rossi's, about everything except the fear that gnawed at her constantly. Her mother's eyes were closed, but Ivy knew she was listening. The doctor said hearing was the last sense to go, that even in the deepest stages of unconsciousness, patients could still hear their loved ones' voices. "There's this man," Ivy found herself saying, "a customer at the restaurant. His name is Vincent. He's complicated, dangerous probably, but he's also kind in his own way. He lost his wife 15 years ago, and I don't think he's ever really recovered. I think he's been drowning all this time, just going through the motions, and maybe talking to me helps him feel a little less alone. I know I shouldn't care about him. I know he's involved in things I don't want to understand, but I do care, and I don't know what to do about that." Her mother's fingers twitched slightly in her hand, and Ivy chose to believe it was a response, a sign that she understood, that she approved. They sat together in the quiet of the hospital room, the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and Ivy felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, the weight of impending loss, of impossible choices, of a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. She didn't know that 3 floors below, in the hospital parking garage, Vincent's security team had just intercepted 2 men with Moretti family connections who'd been asking questions about her at the nurses' station. She didn't know that across the city, in a warehouse on the south side. Vincent was meeting with his most trusted lieutenants, planning a response that would send shockwaves through Chicago's underworld. And she didn't know that in 48 hours everything would change, that the fragile peace she'd been clinging to would shatter, and she'd be forced to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. But for now, in this moment, she just sat with her mother and held her hand and tried to memorize the feel of it, the warmth of it, knowing that soon, too soon, it would be gone, and she'd be left with nothing but memories and the impossible task of learning how to live in a world without the person who'd loved her most. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Chicago in white, covering the dirt and the blood and the sins of the city, at least for a little while. And in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Vincent Castellano stood at the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, Elena's photograph on the table beside him, and made a promise to the ghost of his wife and to the living woman who'd reminded him what it meant to be human. He would protect Ivy Morrison, no matter the cost, even if it meant becoming the monster everyone already believed him to be. The war was coming, and this time, there would be no mercy. The call came at 3 a.m, shattering the fragile quiet of Ivy's vigil at her mother's bedside. She'd fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the hospital bed, her hand still intertwined with her mother's. The phone's vibration jolted her awake, her heart immediately racing with the panic that came from knowing that calls at this hour never brought good news. But it wasn't the hospital. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Ivy Morrison?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a South Side accent that carried an edge of menace. "Who is this? A friend. Or an enemy. Depends on your next move. We have a message for Vincent Castellano, and you're going to deliver it." Ivy's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play stupid. We've been watching you for weeks. We know about the money he gave you, about the cozy conversations in his corner booth, about the way he looks at you like you're something precious. You matter to him, which means you matter to us. Leave me alone." Her voice shook despite her attempt at firmness. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell Vincent that the Moretti family is done playing games. He has 48 hours to cede control of his Southside operations, or we start taking things from him, starting with you." The line went dead. Ivy sat frozen, her hand trembling around the phone. Her mother stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips, and Ivy forced herself to breathe, to think. She should call the police, should report the threat, should do all the logical, rational things a normal person would do. But Vincent's world wasn't normal, and she knew instinctively that involving the authorities would only make things worse. She called the only number she had for him, Rossi's restaurant. It rang 4 times before Maria answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Rossi's is closed. Call back. Maria, it's Ivy. I need Vincent's number. Now. It's an emergency." There was a pause, then Maria's voice sharpened with concern. "What happened? Please, just give me his number." Maria rattled off the digits, and Ivy hung up, immediately dialing. Vincent answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Ivy? They called me. The Morettis. They said..." Her voice broke, and she had to stop, gather herself. "They said I have to give you a message. 48 hours to give them your Southside operations, or they'll come after me." The silence on the other end of the line was more terrifying than any response could have been. When Vincent finally spoke, his voice was utterly calm, utterly cold. "Where are you?" "St. Anthony's. With my mother. Stay there. I'm sending people to you right now. Don't leave the hospital. Don't talk to anyone you don't know. Don't go anywhere alone. Do you understand? Vincent, I don't want to be the reason. This isn't your fault. This is mine. I should have protected you better, should have kept you out of this. But I'm going to fix it. I promise you, Ivy. I'm going to fix it." How? By doing what I should have done months ago. By ending this. He hung up before she could respond. Ivy sat there, her phone still pressed to her ear, and felt the weight of what was coming settle over her like a shroud. She'd been naive to think she could exist in Vincent's orbit without consequences. Naive to believe that kindness and connection could exist separate from the violence that defined his world. 20 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits appeared in the hallway outside her mother's room. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't explain their presence, but Ivy knew they were Vincent's people. They took up positions by the door and the elevator, silent and watchful, and she felt simultaneously safer and more trapped than she'd ever been in her life. Her mother woke briefly around dawn, her eyes fluttering open, focusing on Ivy with effort. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You look worried." "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." "Liar." A ghost of a smile crossed her mother's face. "You were always a terrible liar. What's wrong?" Ivy wanted to protect her, wanted to shield her from this ugliness, but her mother's eyes held that knowing look that mothers have, that ability to see through their children's defenses no matter how carefully constructed. "I got involved with someone. Not romantically, just I became friends with someone I shouldn't have, and now there are complications." "The man from the restaurant? Vincent?" Ivy nodded, surprised. "How did you talk about him when you think I'm asleep? You talk about how sad he is, how lost. You have a good heart, Ivy. Too good sometimes. You want to save everyone." Her mother's hand squeezed hers weakly. "But some people can't be saved. Some people are too far gone." "I don't think he's too far gone. I think he's just forgotten how to be anything other than what people expect him to be." Her mother was quiet for a moment, her breathing labored. "If he's a good man underneath all the bad choices, then maybe you can help him find his way back. But Ivy, promise me something. Promise me you won't lose yourself trying to save him. Promise me you'll protect yourself first." "I promise, Mom." But even as she said it, Ivy wasn't sure it was a promise she could keep. Across the city, in a warehouse that had once housed legitimate shipping operations but now served as the headquarters for Vincent's organization, a very different conversation was taking place. Vincent stood at the head of a long table, surrounded by 15 men who'd served him for years, some for decades. These were his captains, his soldiers, his family in all the ways that mattered, and they were waiting for his orders. "The Morettis have made their move," Vincent said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "They've threatened someone under my protection, someone innocent, and that cannot stand." Marco, his oldest friend and most trusted lieutenant, spoke up. "What do you want us to do, boss?" "I want you to send a message, not with words, with action. I want every Moretti operation in this city shut down by midnight tonight. Their gambling houses, their protection rackets, their drug distribution, all of it. I want them to understand that there are lines you don't cross, and they've crossed one. That's going to start a war," another captain said, his tone cautious. "The war already started. They just didn't realize it yet." Vincent's eyes were hard, unforgiving. "But we're going to finish it, quickly, decisively, and with enough force that no one else gets any ideas about testing me. I've been quiet for 15 years, and people have mistaken that quiet for weakness. It's time to remind Chicago who runs the South Side." The men nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They'd been waiting for this. Ivy realized later when Vincent told her about the meeting. They'd been waiting for him to become the man he used to be, the man who'd built an empire through intelligence and ruthlessness and an unwavering commitment to protecting his own. But Vincent had one more thing to say, one more order that surprised everyone in the room. "And when this is over, when the Morettis are dealt with, I'm stepping back. I'm going to start transitioning control to Marco and the rest of you. I'm done with this life. I've been done for a long time. I just didn't realize it until recently." The room erupted in protests, in questions, in disbelief. But Vincent raised his hand, and silence fell. "I made a promise to my wife 15 years ago, as she was dying. I promised her I'd find a way out, that I wouldn't let this life consume me completely. I broke that promise, but maybe it's not too late to honor it. Maybe there's still time to become someone she'd be proud of." He thought of Ivy then, of her stubborn determination to see the good in him, of the way she'd looked at him in the hospital and told him he was human, that being human was enough. And he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago. He would fight this one last battle, would protect her with everything he had, and then he would walk away. He would find a way to surface, to breathe, to live a life that wasn't defined by violence and fear. But first, he had to make sure Ivy survived, and that meant going to war. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Vincent's organization moved with military precision, striking at Moretti operations across the city. Gambling houses were raided and shut down. Protection payments were intercepted. Key Moretti soldiers found themselves arrested on outstanding warrants that Vincent's connections in the police department had helpfully remembered. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was a demonstration of power, a reminder that Vincent Castellano hadn't become weak. He'd simply been choosing his battles. Ivy remained at the hospital, surrounded by Vincent's security, watching the news reports of increased gang activity on the South Side, and knowing that it was all because of her, because she'd become someone Vincent cared about. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was something else. A strange, fierce pride that he would go to such lengths to protect her, that she mattered enough to him to risk everything. Her mother slipped into unconsciousness on the second day, her body finally surrendering to the cancer that had ravaged it. The doctor said it was a matter of hours now, maybe a day at most. Ivy held her hand and whispered all the things she needed to say. "Thank you. I love you. I'll be okay. You can let go," and waited for the end. Vincent came to the hospital that evening, slipping past his own security to sit with Ivy in the quiet of her mother's room. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her and held her other hand, offering his presence as comfort. They stayed like that for hours, two people bound by grief and violence, and an unexpected connection that neither of them fully understood. At 11:47 p.m., Ivy's mother took her last breath, a soft exhalation that seemed to carry her spirit away with it. Ivy felt the moment of passing like a physical thing, a severing of the cord that had bound them together for 24 years. She didn't cry. She just sat there, holding her mother's still warm hand, and felt the world shift beneath her. Vincent pulled her close, and she let herself lean into him, let herself take comfort from this complicated, dangerous man who understood loss in a way few others could. They sat together in the darkness, surrounded by the beeping of machines that no longer mattered, and mourned. Outside, the December wind howled, and somewhere across the city, the Moretti family was learning that Vincent Castellano was not a man to be threatened, not a man to be tested. The war was reaching its conclusion, swift and brutal and decisive, but in that hospital room, there was only silence and grief, and two people trying to figure out how to keep living when the world kept taking everything they loved. The funeral was small, held on a gray December morning when the temperature hovered just above freezing, and the sky threatened snow that never quite fell. Ivy had chosen a simple service at a chapel on the south side, near the neighborhood where she'd grown up, where her mother had raised her alone after her father's death. There were maybe 20 people in attendance, neighbors, a few of her mother's friends from before the illness had isolated her, some nurses from St. Anthony's who'd cared for her in those final weeks, and Vincent Castellano, sitting in the back row, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than Ivy's entire wardrobe, his presence both comforting and conspicuous. Ivy delivered the eulogy with a steady voice, talking about her mother's strength, her kindness, her determination to give her daughter a better life than she'd had. She talked about the sacrifices her mother had made, the extra shifts she'd worked, the dreams she'd deferred so that Ivy could pursue nursing school. She didn't mention the cancer, the pain, the slow deterioration. Those things didn't define her mother. Love defined her, and Ivy would carry that love forward, would honor it by living the kind of life her mother had wanted for her, full of purpose, of compassion, of hope. After the service, as people filed out into the cold, Vincent approached her. His eyes were red-rimmed, and Ivy realized he'd been crying. This man who'd built an empire on fear and violence, crying for a woman he'd never met, but who reminded him of his own loss. "She would have liked you," Ivy said softly. "My mother. She would have seen past all the rest of it, straight to who you really are." "And who am I really?" Vincent asked, his voice rough. "Someone who's trying. Someone who's still fighting to be better than his worst choices. That's all any of us can do." They stood together in the chapel doorway, watching the mourners disperse, and Vincent made a decision. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Not money this time, but papers. Legal documents. "What is this?" Ivy asked, taking them hesitantly. "Ownership papers for a building in Lincoln Park, 3-bedroom condo paid in full, and a trust fund that'll cover your living expenses and tuition for the next 5 years, until you finish nursing school and get established in your career." Ivy stared at him, shocked. "Vincent, I can't." "Yes, you can. And you will. Because your mother spent her whole life making sure you had opportunities, and I'm not going to let her sacrifice be wasted because you're too proud to accept help." His voice softened. "Please, Ivy, let me do this. Let me honor Elena's memory by helping someone who reminds me of her. Let me do one good thing with all this blood money I've accumulated." Ivy's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, unable to speak. Vincent pulled her into a hug, and they stood there in the chapel doorway, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, bound by loss and the fragile hope of redemption. "What about you?" Ivy finally asked, pulling back. "What happens to you now?" "I'm stepping back. transitioning control of my organization to my lieutenants. I'll still have influence, still have connections, but I won't be running things day to day anymore. I'm going to try to figure out who Vincent Castellano is when he's not a mafia boss. I'm going to try to live the life Elena wanted me to live. That's going to be hard. Everything worth doing is hard. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. But I have a good teacher. You've shown me that it's possible to face impossible situations with grace, to keep fighting even when everything seems lost. If you can do it, maybe I can too. They parted ways that afternoon, Ivy heading to her new condo in Lincoln Park, a beautiful space with hardwood floors and large windows that let in the winter light, and Vincent returning to his penthouse to begin the complicated process of extracting himself from the life he'd led for 30 years. The Moretti family had sued for peace. After Vincent's 48-hour campaign had decimated their operations, they'd underestimated him, mistaken his quiet grief for weakness, and they'd paid the price. The truce was uneasy but holding, and Vincent used his newfound leverage to negotiate protections for the people and businesses in his territory, ensuring that his stepping back wouldn't leave a power vacuum that would hurt innocent people. It took 6 months for the transition to be complete. 6 months of meetings and negotiations, and carefully orchestrated transfers of power. But by the time summer arrived in Chicago, bringing heat and humidity and the smell of Lake Michigan on the breeze, Vincent Castellano was no longer the undisputed boss of the South Side. He was just Vincent, a man with too much money, too many regrets, and a growing determination to make his remaining years count for something. Ivy finished her first year of nursing school with honors. She worked part-time at St. Anthony's, in the oncology ward where her mother had spent her final days, bringing comfort to patients the way Vincent's wife Elena had once done. She thought about her mother every day, carried her memory like a light in the darkness, and tried to live in a way that would make her proud. She and Vincent remained friends, meeting for coffee every Thursday at a small cafe near Lincoln Park, continuing the conversations they'd started in the corner booth at Rossi's. They talked about everything: books, politics, the weather, their pasts, their hopes for the future. Vincent was different now, lighter somehow, as if stepping away from his empire had allowed him to finally breathe after decades of drowning. One Thursday in late August, as they sat outside the cafe watching people walk by, Vincent pulled out his wallet and showed Ivy a photograph. It was Elena, the same picture he'd carried for 15 years, but beside it now was another photo, Ivy and Vincent together, taken at her nursing school graduation, both of them smiling. "I used to think Elena was the only good thing I'd ever had in my life," Vincent said quietly. "The only proof that I was capable of being something other than a monster. But you've shown me that it's not too late, that I can still make choices that honor her memory. You've given me hope, Ivy, and I don't know how to thank you for that." "You already have," Ivy said, gesturing to the world around them. The condo, the education, the freedom to pursue her dreams without the crushing weight of financial desperation. "You've given me a chance to become who I'm meant to be. That's more than enough." They sat together in the summer sunshine, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and helped each other find the light. Vincent would never be able to erase his past, would never be able to undo the violence and the pain he'd caused, but he could move forward. He could choose, every day, to be better than he'd been the day before. He could honor Elena's memory and Ivy's faith in him by becoming the man they'd both believed he could be. And Ivy, carrying her mother's love and her own hard-won strength, would continue to heal people, to bring comfort to those who were suffering, to be the kind of nurse, the kind of person, who saw the humanity in everyone, even the broken, even the lost, even the ones who thought they were beyond redemption. Years later, when Ivy was working as a head nurse at St. Anthony's and Vincent had established a foundation in Elena's name that provided free medical care to families who couldn't afford it. They would still meet for coffee every Thursday. They would still talk about everything and nothing, still find comfort in each other's presence, still be grateful for the unlikely friendship that had saved them both. Because sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes hope appears in a corner booth in an Italian restaurant, in a faded photograph, in the simple act of one person seeing another person's humanity and refusing to look away. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's not too late to surface, to breathe, to become something more than the sum of your worst choices. The rain that had started Vincent and Ivy's story continued to fall on Chicago, washing the streets clean, carrying away the old, and making space for the new. And in that rain, in that endless cycle of cleansing and renewal, two people who'd been drowning found a way to swim, together, toward shore. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more emotional stories, and share in the comments where you're listening from and what part of the story resonated most with you. Your support means everything and helps us continue bringing you powerful narratives that touch the heart.